It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. After that landslide election victory, the Labour government puts growth at the heart of the King's speech, with almost 40 new laws.
Securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission. My ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing.
Some things are familiar, like Rishi Sunak's smoking ban.
A bill will be introduced to progressively increase the age at which people can buy cigarettes and impose limits on the sale and marketing of vapes.
Disappointment, though, from some Labour MPs as there's no end to the two-child benefit cap.
People voted for change, but people also want hope, and I think looking at removing the two-child cap provides that level of hope.
Joining us today, Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, The Observer's Sonia Soda, and we are also hoping to be joined by The Telegraph's Tim Stanley, but he is stuck behind the King in some traffic. This is Politics Live. Well, Sir Keir Starmer has called his programme for government a mission of national renewal. But as we heard there is some stuff that's a little bit familiar. The smoking ban first came up under Rishi Sunak. That's staying. And the government's two-child benefit cap stays. So is this really change or more of the same, Sonia?
Oh, I think it's change. So, yes, there is some stuff that's carried over, and why drop a good idea just because the other side introduced it when it comes to something like the smoking ban? But if you look at the Labour manifesto, it contains quite a lot in terms of the five big missions that Labour wants to achieve. And, from Great British Energy to planning reform to renationalising the railways, there's a lot of stuff in there. The question, I think, for those of us looking from the outside is, does it go far enough to achieve Labour's five missions? And that's going to be the big test for a Labour government over the next 5 years.
Jonathan, does it? You're going
to
disappoint people?
It is obviously about implementing what we promised to do in the election, and that is exactly what the programme announced by the King, spoken by the King, just now is about. It is about, first of all, getting to action straight away, exactly as we have done. Onshore wind ban has gone already. The National Wealth Fund has started to be created. We've got action to recruit the 6,500 additional teachers, and it's wonderful to see that. But what we also need to see in the King's speech, and it was there, are the things that will provide the foundations that make the biggest difference over a parliament. So have people got a decent place to live? That's about building homes. Have they got a secure job and respect in the workplace? That's about the New Deal for working people. Is the economy growing in a way that you can say your kids will be better off than you were? And we lost that under the last 14 years. Yes, all those foundations are in place.
We've got the fastest rate of growth in the G7
Well, we can repeat these arguments from the election, Laura, but obviously that's from population growth from 2010. That was what your record was. Was the economy growing more strongly per head the real measure of success? No, your record was not good on that. And I think, to be honest, that was a fundamental part of the defeat. But clearly, if we're going to see an economy that gives people the living standards that they want, it's got to be better than it was in the last 14 years. That's our belief. That's what we think we can deliver with the measures we're putting forward. I understand the Conservative Party, quite rightly, you'll want to defend your record, but I think your failure in that area was fundamental to the election.
But there's a factual point, Jonathan, that this year we've had the fastest rate of growth in the G7.
Yeah, but you are obviously being judged, or were judged, on your record over 14 years, which was historically poor by British economic standards and poor by comparative standards. So, I mean, by all means, still fight it. But I think you've got to understand
really
how people feel, Laura, about how this was a parliament where at the end of the last parliament, people were worse off than they were at the beginning. And that is significant. And that's got to change. And that means building homes, clean energy, respect in the workplace, working with business to deliver. We've got the lowest business investment in the G7. That's what I've got to try and fix. I think it's only my advice, but the Conservative Party, rather than fight the last battle, maybe think about what needs to change and support us where we're getting it right.
It's what is really important, and we will support you where you are getting things right, and there are aspects in the King's speech today that we will support, like Martin's Law, like the continuation of the ban on smoking. But I think it is really vital to understand the economic inheritance that you've got. We've taken some really difficult decisions after two serious global events in terms of COVID and in terms of Putin's illegal war in Ukraine and the impact that had on cost of living. And we had to spend money. We had to spend the money to do that. And as a result of the difficult decisions we've made, we have an economy which is the fastest growing in the G7. We've got inflation back to target.
You're saying
we've got
unemployment is strong because I think objectively, Laura, you're just not going to get away with that.
Look at the comparison to 2010. Look at the comparison to 2010, right?
Well, hang on,
in terms of the deficit,
there was a global
11%.
financial crisis
yes,
before
we've had
2010.
two of those.
So what you're
right?
saying
So
is when you inherited,
if I could
hang on,
just
just
jump
one
in,
point.
but
If they're
really-
saying they inherited an economy after a global financial crisis, but want the credit for that, but they want to pretend that what they've had to do in their very poor record was all international events that wasn't. I mean, it's just not going to.
No, but also, I'm sorry, you cannot say it's a bad situation when you spent £7 billion last week. You spent £7 billion last week. If the public finances aren't in a good position, then National Wealth Fund with £7 billion.
We did not spend £7 billion.
£7.3 billion.
If I could just jump in, I think it really is important
It's not, that's not what you spent last
when you're
week.
looking at, at the economy over the long term. I don't think that there's an economist out there who would say that the British economy is in rude health. There are long-term structural issues around a lack of growth, around sluggish productivity, around, real wages that haven't gone up that much over the last 14 years. It is partly a product of Conservative government decisions. It's partly a product of external factors. To be honest, though, actually, governments over the last 30, 40 years haven't really cracked this nut. I think it's very interesting. There is stuff in the Labour agenda that is saying we want to get the economy kick-started again. But if you take a step back, there are still economists who say it's not quite enough. Planning reform plus green investment, there may still need to be a bit more.
They want more. OK, well, we're going to stick with this now because, of course, growth was right at the heart of the King's speech. So let me introduce our guest on a very sunny College Green, Christine Jardine, the Liberal Democrat MP. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to have that conversation about growth now, let's hear what the King had to say on this.
My ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing. They will also pursue sustainable growth by encouraging investment in industry, skills and new technologies.
So, Christine, will this programme deliver growth in your view?
Well, we have to see and we have to hope that it does, because growth is an aim. It's not a policy, it's an aim, and it should be the aim of all governments to deliver growth in the economy. And what we're seeing from this government is a very different atmosphere, a very different approach from we experienced at the last state opening, which was a government that was tired, which had run out of ideas. Pedicabs were the most exciting thing they could come up with, whereas this speech today did show some sort of determination, some enthusiasm and some determination to get some growth in the economy through investment, through building, through creating the housing that we all feel is going to be so important to getting us back on our feet.
So a fair amount of positivity from the Liberal Democrats on this Labour King's speech.
Well, we have to wait and see if it's going to be enough, and we want to see more detail, but at the same time, we all want growth back in the economy. And if the government can deliver it, then that would be a good thing for all of us. But we have to see the detail of what it is they're planning, and we have to know that the policies that they come up with are good, sound policies.
Laura, are you as positive as Christine is?
Look, as I said just now, we know our role as opposition is to scrutinise what the government is planning to do and support where it is the right thing to do. I think we are, as Christine mentioned, lacking in detail on some of the things that have been put forward today. But I think that we will make sure that people aren't concreting all over the green belt, that there is no dilution in English and maths in terms of the education reforms, and also that we are making sure that we're holding Labour to their promise not to raise taxes on working people.
OK, Jonathan.
Well, look, I think you've got there in the King's speech a set of proposals. You add them together, whether it is the changes to the apprenticeship levy, the improvement of the trading relationship with the European Union, the Industrial Strategy Council, the ambitions on green energy, the aspirations on planning, that are added together, something which is really quite significant. And what I hope is, look, people will sometimes say to person like me, well, look, everyone wants growth. Well, yeah, they do. But are they willing to make the political decisions, accept the trade-offs, that will deliver that? Now, in the last 14 years, people weren't, or the government wasn't willing to do it. We saw, you could go into local government questions, Conservative MP after Conservative MP saying, no houses built in my area. That is not going to deliver us what we need. And I think the mandate Labour has is to say, We've got a set of proposals. We've got a mandate for those proposals. That is what we're going to do.
Well, you mentioned trade-offs, but those trade-offs can be very hard for individual communities, can't they? Let's just look at this headline in the Times now. Local residents will lose the right to block new housing in the King's Speech. Now, that is going to be a very bitter pill to swallow, isn't it, for some communities?
Well, the biggest trade-off is for young people who have nowhere to live. You know, the vast majority, the majority tenure for young people in Britain today is living with their parents. So that's the trade-off that's happening at the minute. It isn't about telling people they've got no say in where housing goes. Of course it isn't. It is about saying, however, we need to build homes. Local communities will decide where they go, but they will not be able to say anymore, no homes at all.
Okay.
I think that is reasonable, and I think Labour's got a mandate for it. And I think, look, the existing system, which takes ages, whether you want to build anything, right? It doesn't actually deliver what people want at the end.
OK. Christine, given that you are so positive about this King's Speech, can we take it then that the Liberal Democrats will not be objecting to some of these changes to planning?
No, I said we haven't seen the details yet. What we're concerned about is that we build houses, but that we build them in the right place. We have to preserve our green belt. And there are loads of brown belt sites that could be used. There's lots of abandoned houses, abandoned buildings, which could be brought back into use. Just because the government says it's going to build housing, which we all need, doesn't mean that the planning reforms it's suggesting are the right ones, and we have to see the details. So yes, we want growth, yes, we want more housing, but they have to be the right houses in the right place and protect the green belt.
That is always the crux of it, isn't it, Christine? It's
Yes.
never in individual MPs' constituencies, on the macro level.
It's on a macro level. We have to build houses, but we have to build them in the right place. There's no point in
Not
building
in Liberal
massive...
Democrat constituencies,
No,
maybe.
not in the green belt. I have lots of housing developments in my constituency, and good housing developments with good infrastructure in the right place are what communities want. But what they don't want are houses built in the green belt without infrastructure, without doctors' surgeries, without dentists, without roads, without schools. You can't just build houses anywhere. You have to make sure you build them in the right places. And that's what we will be watching for from these proposals from the Labour Party, that they take that into account, and the needs of local communities have to be met. It's not a case of them being able to block it. It's a case of their needs and their need for housing being met in the right places with the right houses. Social housing is important, smaller houses. It's not all just big luxury developments.
OK. Christine Jardine, there are lots of people after your time, I know, so thank you very much for joining us on Politics Live. Thank you. Sonia, that's the perennial thing, though, isn't it? Everybody says, yes, we've got to build more houses, but then when it comes to it, those passionate local campaigns, people have often very good reasons, very well-researched reasons why they don't want a project greenlit. That's it.
That is the macro problem with housing, which is that actually we've had political parties committed to house building targets, really big numbers, and the houses just don't get built. I think if Labour can follow through these plans on planning reforms, I think Jonathan is right. They are very significant. They could deliver more housing, and that's really important. I think taking a step back, though, the question is, will they deliver enough homes to tackle the housing affordability crisis? And that's where I'm a bit sceptical, actually. I think planning has to be part of the mix. I think Labour is right on that. But planning is not the only barrier to houses being built. Actually, you've got developers, you've got house builders. It's in their interest to build fewer houses sometimes to keep the prices up so they make more profit. So the only time that we've built enough homes as a country has been in the sort of 20 or 30 years post the Second World War, where actually you had the government investing in building council housing. So the kind of thing I would like to see from Labour alongside the planning reforms, alongside actually the renters reforms, which they're also doing and have announced in the King's Speech, which are very, very important for particularly young people, young families who don't have the security of tenure and can get kicked out at a moment's notice. But the third thing I think that we really need to see from Labour is public investment in housing again. Why not put government investment in building affordable homes for rent for young people so they can go to where the jobs are? We've got too many young people who are trapped basically because they can't afford a deposit. They're still living at home. And actually you could borrow to do that because you've got a guaranteed rent stream that would be below market rent, but you'd still be charging young people rent. That could be something that the Labour government could do.
Absolutely fair point to say it's not just planning, but I think without planning, whatever investment you put in doesn't actually get where you need to be. On secure homes, abolishing no-fault evictions, absolutely part of the programme. Just on the local opposition point, because I think this is probably a significant part of the argument this Parliament will be this. one of Labour's proposals in our manifesto is about how we treat what's called hope value. So it's basically the uplift in land value when you get planning permission. A greater proportion of that, because it's a huge increase, will go towards providing the homes and infrastructure that we all know is needed. So I understand at the minute, look, there are some people who want nothing built near them. There's another group of people who say, look, it's been a tough decade and a half for public services. I just want to know there'll be a doctor, a school place, and using some of that uplift in real value, and it's big money, to deliver that is part of the plan. And that's how, to be honest, the new towns were built in the past. We have done this successfully as a country. Look at the 1930s when the private sector delivered vast amount of homes in the UK. It's got to be a package, but fundamentally the question is, will politicians accept the political argument that needs to be made? And this Labour government accepts that and will make that argument.
Does it? I mean, let's look at this headline in the Telegraph now, because again, this is the issue, isn't it? Half of the cabinet accused of house building hypocrisy. So we can go through Keir Starmer's cabinet, and including the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves, David Lammy. There's a big long list of members of the shadow cabinet who've all objected to building in their own constituencies. Your name isn't actually on the list, Jonathan.
People in my constituency back in Stalybridge and Hyde would acknowledge that I have always made the argument for home building. But I would say, I don't mind people saying an objection about a particular development if they're saying where it would go. And I don't think that list fully reflects the positions that colleagues have taken.
But I suppose what that
we're
list...
still saying under this proposal, the point is you're not going to be able to say no homes.
No, but I suppose what that list illustrates is that even if you hold that belief, there is always an exception, isn't there, where it affects your community.
I don't think for the Labour Party. I genuinely don't. And I think the way the campaign played out, where, frankly, everyone who's been elected to the House of Commons this time round has got to accept its higher growth or some other difficult decisions, because the economy only grows as it did in the last 14 years. Tough decisions will come. I think what's really interesting is, for instance, we've got Green MPs in bigger numbers in Parliament. They are notorious for opposing all kinds of even clean energy infrastructure. Liberal Democrats have a history of that as well. Conservative Party very much the anti-growth coalition around that building side. So how this affects how those debates work in Parliament, I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, and Laura, in a constituency like yours, very leafy, very lovely place, lots of people want to live in Sevenoaks.
Yes.
How will that debate work on the ground? You must be aware of this all the time. There'll be loads of young people that want somewhere to live.
Well, absolutely. We have to strike that right balance. And I would argue that we're actually doing a good job of that at the moment. We are building very much in Sevenoaks, but we're building in the right places with the right infrastructure to go alongside it. I think we'll have to see the detail of some of this, because we do need to build homes. We built 2.5 million homes under the Conservatives. We need to make sure that we're building more. Absolutely. Young people need to get on the ladder. So we'll have to see the detail of what exactly is being proposed. But we need to make absolutely sure that we're preserving our green belt, because it's fundamental to our national character.
You may have noticed that we have been joined by the BBC's Henry Zeffman. He's not, in fact, Tim Stanley, but he's very kindly agreed to come in and sit in that chair. How much of a battle do you think this will be, Henry, in this next Parliament? This tension between the macro thing, we need to build houses, and then the individual MPs who have their constituents knocking on their door saying, we don't want this.
I think it's certainly going to be a tension, and I think in some senses the Labour Party might be a victim of their own electoral success, because there are seats, rural seats across England where the Labour Party's never had a look in before, which are now represented by Labour MPs, and I'm sure there are constituents in those seats who will have complained to their local Conservative MP in the past about developments and got a different answer to the one they may well now get from their local Labour MPs. I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic. But look, more generally, the tone is going to have to be set from the centre, from people like Johnny over there, and the question will be whether they have the political stomach to force through what will often be controversial projects. I mean, if they don't have that with a majority of this size, then clearly planning reform is never possible in this country, because the reality is you will have, I'm sure, individual MPs being upset about projects in their constituencies, but the Labour majority is vast, and they ought to be able to, I guess, to use the word of this topic, bulldoze through that opposition.
Ooh, they won't like that very much. What is interesting, I think, is that another part of the King's speech talks about devolution and devolving powers to the English regions. But at the same time, if we're talking about big projects like wind farms, solar farms, data farms, this is big national infrastructure. And under the King's speech, that is now going to be something that local planners don't have control over. That's stuff that will be decisions that will be taken by ministers. So is there a bit of a contradiction there?
No, I think it's a fair question, but it's not a contradiction. First of all, just look at, frankly, any other European country, even look at the US in terms of the different layers of authority that exist in their political system. I think, first of all, I'll give you my own area as an example. Greater Manchester, we put in our housing plan when the housing targets were still there, before the backbench Tories, removed the government's ambition in that area of the previous government. That conversation in Greater Manchester has been about where the homes go, and it's been led by the mayor, and actually that's the right switch of responsibilities between those places. There are some nationally significant infrastructure projects, and they've got to be done in a better way. But I would just say, is anyone happy at the minute that it takes on average 14 years to build an offshore wind farm in the UK? In my own constituency, we've been arguing for a bypass since 1965. Look how long the M6 toll road took, from Harold Wilson's Labour government to Tony Blair's Labour government. I mean, do we think this is working at the minute? That should be the first point. It's not working. Is there a better way to do it? It doesn't mean that people lose out, they lose their say, but we've got to understand that how we do this in length and the cost is worse than any comparable country, and we've got to do it better.
Is it working, Laura?
I think there are improvements that can be made. Indeed, we were making improvements. And this is what I mean in terms of we're going to look at the detail of this. And I think where it is sensible and makes, and will work on a national level, we will support it. But where there are proposals that will concrete over the green belt, will mean that houses come without any of the supporting infrastructure, we will oppose those.
OK, I just want to show you a tweet now from Aliba Ray, who covers politics for Bloomberg. It says here, if you can see that, I'm struggling to. It says, Rayner, meaning Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, left chastened after Cabinet colleagues take chunks of her policy brief. Reeves' speech on planning, Reynolds leading New Deal through Parliament. Well, the Reynolds referred to there is you, I think, Jonathan.
That's just not true. I mean, that's just not true. The New Deal for working people is a comprehensive set of measures to make work pay, give people more security. Some of it is employment law. Obviously, labour markets sit in the Department of Business. Some is in the Equalities Department. Some is in actually the Cabinet Office around procurement. The Cabinet Committee structure that we've got, Angela is the chair of that, and the respective Secretaries of State sit as part of those plans and work together collectively to deliver it. So I know there's always bits of gossip around, there's a new Parliament, new government. Completely wrong in terms of what that...
So you haven't stolen any of her brief?
Absolutely not, and we've already had, well, you call them bilaterals now when you meet your colleagues for Cabinet meetings, but we've already had that working closely together, speaking all the time, and politically united in what we're trying to do.
Sonia?
Well, this is politics. There are always bits of gossip. There are always, some people who are briefing against some people and carping against each other. So, we shouldn't be too surprised about that. I think there is a more serious point, though, which Jonathan sort of alluded to, which is that Keir Starmer said he's going to run his government along the lines of these 5 missions that he's got for the country. And there are going to be 5 sort of mission boards that look at delivering on these issues. And, it all sounds good on paper. But, there will be, again, we're in the very, very early days of the Labour government. So the question will be, how will it work? There are so many of these missions that are completely cross-cutting. The one that Jonathan just talked about, the one around class, breaking the class barrier and extending opportunity to all children and young people. Some of these are incredibly cross-cutting. They go across many government departments. So obviously we will need to see Labour ministers working very well together. I'm sure there's a good chance of that. But
You've got a shared set of objectives in a way you didn't have under the last government. But Sonia's absolutely right. It's not... The whole government has to deliver on these missions. It's not one person or 2 people own them.
Henry, what are you hearing on that gossip?
Well, the other thing, and I'm never going to complain about people briefing about what's going on. I'm not going to engineer my own redundancy. And I do think it's striking, by the way. Obviously, I'd expect Jonathan to say what he said, but in the briefing pack that came out with the King's speech, it's very clear that it's Jonathan's department that is responsible for this legislation. If we'd had this conversation 3 weeks ago, I might have expected it to be a unit within Angela Rayner's department. But anyway, that hasn't turned out to be how it happens. But we'll watch how the relationships, bilateral and otherwise, progress. But on the mission boards, one thing worth noting, it's not just cabinet committees. Keir Starmer has told us, right back when he made his speech announcing the missions a couple of years ago, he said it's going to be about changing how government operates, and there'll be boards with people coming in from outside government, trade unions, other sort of stakeholder groups, to use that awful word. I'm quite fascinated to see how that works, whether those do end up being the engine of government policy or whether ultimately, actually, it just ends up being cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister and the centre deciding what they want to do.
Well, we're going to stick with growth in a way and talk a little bit about your trip to Italy yesterday, Jonathan. One of the aspects that the government spoke about during the campaign in terms of resetting the economy was having I think you called it a closer, more mature relationship with our friends in the EU. How much closer are you talking about, and what kind of conversations were you having yesterday?
Well, look, the G7 trade summit yesterday in Italy was a great chance to go out and put the message of a new government to so many important allies, colleagues, the international community about the programme we've got and the opportunities that now exist in the UK with the political mandate, political stability, to be frank, that the new government now has. On specifically the EU relationship, look, how we campaigned, what was in our manifesto, is how we will govern. So it's not about refighting the arguments, it's not about customs union or single market, but are there practical trade-based improvements we could make to that relationship around professional qualifications and how food and agricultural products are treated? Yes, there's a basis for that. And to be honest, there's been a really very, very welcome response on the other side to that. Of course, there's a long way to go, but getting out there, frankly saying this is a relationship which is, with respect, not determined by the internal politics of the Conservative Party, which has obviously been a pretty big deal for the last few years, is a major opportunity for the national interest to be pursued.
I suppose Keir Starmer has been very clear, not rejoining the single market, not rejoining the customs union. With that being said, are the kind of deals you're talking about things like the veterinary agreements, that kind of thing, that's tinkering, some would say, and that isn't really going to help your growth agenda?
Well, look, I think, first of all, it will help because these are practical, trade-based improvements if we're able to deliver them. I think focusing on those rather than reliving those arguments is not just the right choice politically, I think it's the right choice economically, because I don't think businesses will look again at the UK if they think we're just never going to get past this argument that came around through the Brexit referendum. They want some stability. They want actually to see the UK relative to maybe some other places as a place that they can have some confidence in. And we can do that. And to be honest, I don't think, no matter how people feel about how it's gone, and of course people feel very strongly still about Brexit, I don't think being locked in this debate forever is the right way to go. I think looking to the future is a far better, more pragmatic, but actually much better for the economy and us all.
A reset welcome, Laura?
Look, I mean, it was nice in the last section to be talking about the infighting within the Labour Party rather than my own party. So this is making a very pleasant change so far today. But I think on the EU, again, look, we've had this conversation about the EU, under the last government. We know what the price was offered then. It wasn't one that we were willing to accept, but let's see whether things can be different here. I doubt it, but I wish them the best of luck.
Okay.
I think one of the weird things for us, though, as a country is when you take a step back, we're a country with sluggish productivity growth. One of the first places you'd look in terms of boosting growth is removing barriers, with your trading barriers with your nearest neighbour. We've chosen to put them up. And, while small bits of tinkering, it might offer the odd little boost. I think you're right that it is quite incremental. And I think the tricky thing is that, we'd get back into the whole conversation again about the EU not wanting us to cherry pick. They've moved past Brexit. I sort of suspect, if you want to add a big trade boost, through relations with the EU, you probably are looking at something quite major, like negotiations over a number of years to rejoin the customs union. And I sort of think that on a pragmatic basis, maybe that's where we'll end up at some point. But it may not be in the EU's interest by then.
And it may be quite a long time in the future. We don't know. Let's move on and talk about immigration now, which wasn't actually in the King's speech. Two things specifically which were discussed during the election campaign. Keir Starmer said that levels of legal immigration were too high and pledged that companies that broke employment laws, such as failing to pay their staff a minimum wage, would be banned from hiring workers from abroad. And the second thing that was talked about during the campaign was proposed legislation to limit companies' access to the visa system if they fail to train and recruit British workers. Jonathan, why aren't those things in the King's speech?
Well, look, there's two parts to this argument. On illegal immigration, which did form quite a big part of the campaign, you've got the creation of the Border Security Command, which is about addressing that, not doing the gimmick of Rwanda. And on legal immigration. It's the creation of Skills England and a much closer relationship between how the skills system works and how the immigration system works. Now, that is everything from things like reform of the apprenticeship levy, which is in the King's Speech, and how this will be coordinated across government. We acknowledge when you've got a situation where some jobs have been on the shortage occupation list basically forever, people do not feel that is a market sensitive, a programme, a system that works in response to what the economy needs. I think it's just inert and it doesn't really deliver what is required. So you're seeing a much, I think, different approach in philosophy in how government should deal with these things and practical changes.
So essentially, business is telling you if you take those steps now, this would not be a good move.
No, I'm saying the plan that was part of Labour's argument in the manifesto and in the election campaign is implemented in those measures, whether it's the apprenticeship levy or Skills England, that are in the King's Speech.
Via another means.
Well, because to deliver lower levels of immigration, you've got to address the skills system as part of that.
Yeah,
but
those...
You're saying you're going to do that without recognising what business needs.
But those specific things were in the manifesto and they're not in the King's Speech.
Oh, well, they remain Labour policy, and I'll find out for you exactly how we plan to implement them. But the big thing here has got to be about the coordination between the immigration system and the skills system.
But
and that is
I
part
mean,
of our proposal.
you are business secretary, and this is very much your area, and you're saying you're not quite sure how you're going to get to that point yet.
No,
to
I'm
these two
saying
things.
you're asking a very, to be honest, minor facet of a wider programme that brings together a very different approach from government as to how we tackle these things. We do think legal immigration, which is very, very high by historical levels, has to come down. And I think that's entirely consistent, by the way, with welcoming people who come to the country to make a contribution. But it can't be the levels it's been at for the last few years indefinitely. And you've got to meet what business needs, not just through always saying it's going to be immigration that's the answer. It's going to be part of the answer, but a better skills system, more responsive to what business needs, has got to be a part of that.
Okay, but not yet taking those specific steps which you mentioned in your manifesto.
Well, look, they remain our policy. I'll find out for you which one of the many bills we presented today are part of that.
Yeah.
But I think
No, I mean,
the
I'm
big
sure...
pitch that we're making is a substantial departure, both on illegal and legal immigration, from the last.
Okay, well, when you know, come back on the programme. I'm sure Joe would love to ask you about it. Laura?
I think, look, it tells you all that you need to know, that there are no real measures within this King's Speech to bring down legal migration over here. And that is going to be a serious problem. I mean, I know there's also a lot of pressure within the Labour Party to actually turn around on a lot of the steps we've taken to actually bring legal migration down. So let's see what happens in the next coming months and years.
Legal migration was at a historic high.
Yeah, and it was coming down.
You've actually tripled it since the Brexit referendum, haven't you? I mean,
but we've taken measures to bring it down by 300,000, as you know, Jonathan.
Took the measures to bring it up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we can have this argument again. We've had it many times with the election. We can carry on. But I think the point is just whether. Yes, but you're in charge of it now.
Yeah,
you're in charge of it now. So this is the point. So is it going to go down or is it going to come up? And then we're going to see. Well, thanks to the measures that we introduced beforehand. But I think that the point is that in this King's Speech, you didn't have those measures to tackle legal migration. And also on the illegal migration side, again, they've immediately scrapped Rwanda without really an answer for what they're going to do next. There's the Border Command, obviously one existing in a different form already. So I think the proof will be in the pudding as to whether numbers go up or down in the coming months.
I just say on the Border Command, that is about processing people who arrive at present, whereas this is a substantial departure because it's about tackling the criminal gangs. Whatever the names of these things, they are two quite different approaches. I think it is quite important to say that.
I would have.
I'm not sure that anyone really thought that the Rwanda plan was going to work anyway, deporting a tiny proportion of the people who arrive in the UK to Rwanda as a deterrence measure. Lots of experts had real issues with that as a plan. I find this debate about illegal migration quite frustrating, actually, abstract. Is it too high? Is it too low? It's obviously about your needs as a country, your needs as an economy, where people are going to live, etc. Are you prepared to, tax migrants, invest that money in public services? Migrants pay tax, but that money hasn't been invested in public services over the last 14 years. This is why I think people have felt that there are issues with GPs and schools. But, it's been high because of the Ukraine scheme, because of the Hong Kong visa scheme, also because the government had to relax entry requirements for social care workers. Quite right too, because social care has been on its knees and even more older people would be going out without the care they need. So I sort of feel like it's not a very useful debate to talk about in abstract. Is it too high or too low? It's high at the moment because we don't have enough people working in social care in the NHS, and we're reliant on nurses from abroad to care for people when they're in hospital.
And Henry, given where public opinion is, according to some pollsters on immigration. This is going to be another difficult one for the government, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is in the last Parliament, over the last 5 years, immigration was obviously a really fraught topic. I think actually it's going to become an even broader debate in this Parliament, because though they're a tiny proportion of Parliament, you have 5 Reform UK MPs who are going to be taking a tougher line than the Conservatives on the right on immigration, but I think vocalising views that some Conservatives quietly hold. And then on the other side, you'll have Green MPs, who I think, 4 of them, who I think will say, actually, the numbers don't need to come down, unlike the Labour Party. And I think, frankly, that's the private view of some, not loads, but some Labour MPs, particularly on the left of the Labour Party. So I think you're going to have that sort of dynamic playing out. One other point, this is very niche, but I do think it's important. Yvette Cooper is now the Home Secretary. She had been the Shadow Home Secretary. But when Keir Starmer appointed the ministers working with her at the Home Office, he changed the people who had been doing that job in opposition and basically got some of the very few remaining Labour MPs who had previously been ministers in government to go to the Home Office. So Angela Eagle, one of the most experienced Labour MPs, Diana Johnson, she had been chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, also brought in someone to the House of Lords, a former Home Office Minister, David Hanson. That is the kind of ministerial appointments equivalent of throwing the kitchen sink at it, and I think that's because they know it is very important to the credibility and success of this government.
You just called Yvette Cooper a kitchen sink. Thank you very much, Henry Sefferman, for joining us. We're going to let you go now because I think I've seen the lesser-spotted Tim Stanley sneaking into the studio, so we'll try and get him into a chair. There's been a lot of pomp and circumstance here in Westminster this morning. Let's have a listen to some of it. There we go. We're going to talk about constitutional changes now. The King's speech stated that the Labour government will abolish all hereditary peers in the UK House of Lords in its first term. I think we can see some of those hereditary peers in those shots that we're looking at of the King making his way into the upper house earlier. Tim has actually joined us. You'll be able to see in a moment. But we can now speak to one of those hereditary peers. Lord Inglewood, who's an unaffiliated peer, joins us now from his home. Hello, Lord Inglewood. Thank you for joining us. So what do you make of this plan to get rid of all of you guys?
Well, it's hardly a surprise. As one of the accepted 92 hereditary peers, I reckon been living on death row for about a quarter of a century. The question, I mean, speaking as from my own personal perspective, and I'm non-affiliated, has no political balance behind it. The time for hereditary peers in the second chamber, I believe, is over. And the whole question really now relates about the process of evolving our constitutional arrangements forward from where we are now.
So how would you hope that would be? How would you hope that would be done then? How would it evolve?
Well, the feeling around the House of Lords was that they were going to, that the new government was going to, if it was elected, would propose a moratorium on the process of topping up the departing hereditary peers and let the process take its course within the framework of the proposed 80-year-old retirement.
Yeah. So if it's
not
clear
to me, it's not clear to me at all quite what it is the government is proposing in detail.
All right.
And I think it's a pity, let's put it that way, that if we're going to bring forward this kind of reform, and I'm not opposed to it in principle, that to have it very aggressive. An evolutionary change is always better, in my view, than a revolutionary change.
Okay. Jonathan, as we have you here, you can perhaps tell Lord Inglewood, are you going for an aggressive approach?
Well, that was a really fair set of comments there, reflecting on the fact that clearly the House of Lords has got to change. For the retirement age, that will mean when people hit that age at the end of that parliamentary session, they will retire. And for the hereditary peers, I'm not sure if that has been determined, what their exit timeframe will be, but of course we will be engaging with all the people in the House of Lords who do a good job.
Okay, all right. Tim, you've made it. You're here.
Yes.
Yes. You look rather weary.
I didn't see the King's speech, but I saw the enormous crowds trying to see the King's speech.
Well,
so I saw it from behind.
You saw some of the pomp and circumstance.
Right, can I just check? There'll be a retirement age, right? And what is the retirement age?
It'll be 80.
So one can serve as President of the United States, but you can't serve in the House of Lords.
That'll be the case.
Right, okay. So we're in a very English position here, whereby me, common as muck, I'd like to keep the hereditary peers. The hereditary peer actually appears to be in favour of getting rid of them, but that's the mad country.
How very
we live in.
British.
I think the House of Lords is a very British thing in itself, we can say that.
Well,
Why do you think it would be a good idea to keep the hereditary peers?
Well, because hereditary peers bring with them experience. They are truly independent. Therefore, the way they think and they vote is not controlled in the same way by party or by the trading of favours that you get with other peers. Why would you get rid of those who are old? Why don't you get rid of those who are very young? Because there are some peers who have been appointed who have been absurdly young with very little life experience. But that just brings us back to the problem. The real problem is not with the hereditary peers. The real problem is the way in which the House of Lords as an institution has been denigrated by the abuse piled upon it by various prime ministers who have stuffed it with their friends regardless of their talent or experience or ability. So we're now left with the Lords that, because of that damage to its reputation, it kind of opens the door to saying, well, why not reform it? I'd go one step further and say, why not scrap it? Why not go unicameralist? What I suspect we're going to end up with, this is a first step by Labour, is we're going to move towards what Gordon Brown wants, which is a second chamber which leans towards assemblies and the regions. It's going to bake in devolution. It's going to grant lots of power to local chiefs and to try to shape legislation. I'm very uncomfortable with that. A primary power in this country is the Commons. That's where the sovereignty lies. That's what we vote for. And there should be a second chamber which is as independent and, in a sense, removed from the electoral process as possible. And that's what the old hereditary peers used to embody.
Lord Inglewood, it sounds as though you are somewhat resigned to the eventual sort of demise of the hereditary peers. But in your view, would it be a good thing to maintain the House of Lords as a house of experts with life peers, or would you like to see greater constitutional change?
I think that Tim is very mistaken in looking towards a unicameral parliament. I'm a great believer in checks and balances in our constitution, because that stops a very great deal of damage. And if you end up with a unicameral parliament, I think that there's a real risk of that. And there's a real danger of that now in some of the legislation we've seen recently. The House of Commons pays lip service to the views of the other part of Parliament, that is the House of Lords, and the government in the smoke-filled rooms and the kind of people who take these decisions just decide to steamroll it. I don't think that's right. I think what we're seeing evolving, if we aren't careful, is a kind of return to the 17th century concept of the divine right of kings, whereby once a political party has become the government by virtue of winning a general election, it then thinks it can do absolutely anything to anybody, anywhere. And that is very wrong, because it undercuts the basis of freedom, which is at the core of our political system.
Well,
It's doing these things, which is very difficult. It's not describing the ideas. It is finding a way that has the balances inherent in it, that preserves freedoms, preserves the power of the government.
Let's let Jonathan Reynolds respond to that.
More than happy to confirm we don't support the divine right of kings.
I was just about to ask you about your divine right.
How Parliament works. Look, from the perspective of someone who's been in the Commons for a bit, governments tend to only accept amendments in the Lords rather than in the Commons. I imagine a lot of Conservative colleagues think the Lords had quite an influence on the policy programme of the last few years. Certainly, how we operate at present, the legislation as it leaves the House of Commons is not fit for the statute book without that process to go through. So I think we've got to reflect that's how the system works at present. But I don't think expertise or independence only comes from hereditary peers. I think this is an unfinished job from the previous reform. No, I agree.
Do you want to come back there, Lord Inglewood?
Well, I just said that I'm not claiming that the hereditary peerage is inherently cleverer, more able to do things than the rest of the community. That's one of the reasons why.
No, I agree with what Tim was saying about independence.
It's a question of evolving the wider political process. And there's a huge scope for argument and debate about what that should be, to a system which is, in my opinion, be more fit for the 21st century.
I actually really agree with that. So I think we need a second chamber. I think it plays an important role in terms of expertise. I also totally agree with Tim that this House of Lords has been, packed by prime ministers putting in their mates as a reward, which is actually, it's both parties, and it's kind of disgusting in my view. Serving in a government should not entitle you to, a seat in our legislature for life. I think that's really corrupt. What I would do is carry on with the House of Lords that is about expertise. I'd remove political appointments. I would give it out to citizens' panels to recruit experts for the House of Lords to sit for a fixed term or 2 fixed terms. I think that would be a great way of getting expertise in, having a democratic influence. Why can't we trust the people on it? I think they would do a much better job than prime ministers.
I think the House of Lords is one of those things that on paper shouldn't work, but does. I have seen up close the improvements that it makes to legislation constantly.
And on the hereditary peers?
I think on that we'll have to look at the detail. But I'm very conscious to defend the House of Lords because honestly, people at home don't understand the kind of work that they do, the detailed line by line scrutiny of bills, right? Which is stuff that people don't see, that it's not in the public eye, but it does do a lot to improve legislation. So I think we need to bear that in mind with any change.
All right.
Do that as well through
committees.
By the way, I do believe the divine.
Okay. Thank you for on that bombshell. That's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Don't shit yourself. But there might actually be some kind of PMQs today. I didn't even know that. I thought it was just going to be a waffle fest. And I'm like, oh yeah, we'll see the Prime Minister today. I was like, really? Okay. I thought it'd be next week. You never know. If it pops up, I'll stream it, apparently. But I don't know when. They only have PMQs at 12, and it literally just open Parliament, so fuck knows when they get back. Well, lunch break. Some shit, I don't know. Might be 3 o'clock, something like that. Because it won't be a long session, that's for sure. Yeah. So anyway, if anything pops up, whatever, I'll stream it. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your night. It's a nice day here today, actually. So enjoy what we call summer in Britain. If you're British, that is. But you get the point. I'll be back later anyway. Ta-ra.